This podcast explores the assumptions we make about learning and motivation and child development, the problematic practices and policies pertaining to pedagogy. That sentence was a test of my microphone's pop filter. But all of this takes place in a context, right? In a political system that governs our educational system, which in turn informs what happens in classrooms. So today, I want to take a look at that bigger arena, and specifically at the right-wing assault on public schooling that's been, going on for quite some time, but has been accelerating under Trump and an increasingly radicalized Republican Party. My guest, to lead us through the political thicket, to help us figure out the difference between vouchers and privatization, between anti-government and culturally conservative factions on the right, between the views on education of right-wing politicians and those of their constituents. The person to help us with all of this is Jennifer Berkshire. Jennifer had a blog for many years called Edu-Shyster, and she went on to write such books as A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door and The Education Wars, both co-authored with Jack Schneider, who's an educational historian at the University of Massachusetts, with whom she hosts a podcast called Have You Heard? She also teaches in the Education Studies program at Yale and the Boston College Prison Education program. And she spends a lot of time traveling through the middle section of the U.S. to learn what ordinary people think about education and where there's a possibility of organizing and creating unexpected alliances in order to support our schools. A conversation with Jennifer Berkshire about public education, its enemies and their motives, its supporters and the challenges that face them, right now on Kohn Zone. I'm Alfie Kohn. Jennifer Berkshire, welcome. I'm delighted to have someone with your background to help our listeners think about the large public policy-related issues in education. And, the right wing has a school-related agenda that we've seen going after immigrants and trans kids and imposing religion on public schools, banning books, undermining a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and rewriting history to sanitize it, and what else? Substituting patriotic indoctrination for critical thinking and all of that. But at the same time, they're going after public education itself, not just changing what happens in public schools. So let's start from the beginning, as it were. You wrote, many Americans intuitively understand the relationship between public education and a functional democracy. Do they? And what is, for those who don't, what is it?
Yeah, what a great question, because it's the sort of thing that we say all the time, almost reflexively, right? Public education, It's a pillar of democracy. And, I've been on this self-guided tour through the history of American public education. And what you find is really, like, from the earliest days, you find people fighting over what that actually means. Mm-hmm. Like, what is it that we're, I'm interested in the fact that we seem to be going through another round of the sort of public school panic that comes down upon us regularly. So all of a sudden you hear pundits in mainstream publications gnashing their teeth about the decline in student test scores.
Yep.
And so the first time that we saw this was in the 70s, the 1870s, right? In the sense that there had been a time where schools were good, but that was in the past. And that, like schools had once done a good job of teaching kids to read, but they didn't anymore. And so, you start to look around and you realize, wow, even then people did not agree on what the purpose of public education is. And I think this gets at, right to that question you asked, but also to that long list of agenda items that seem to be on the right wing to-do list. Both the agenda that they're working through the schools, right? Trying to limit what teachers can teach and kids can talk, but also the idea that maybe we shouldn't have public schools at all. Maybe what we should do instead is just give money directly to parents and let them decide not just where the money goes, but what education is. And so right away we see that like actually we have a deep divide over what the purpose of public education is. And if we're fighting about democracy and whether we should even have it, whether the extension of things like civil rights has gone too far and maybe it's time to start rolling some of them back, it's no surprise at all that we can't answer that basic question that you just asked.
So why do you think public education is critical to a democratic society?
So I think that it is the foundational place where we start to think about who we are and how we connect to one another. I just listened to a fantastic episode of your podcast, an interview that you did with Susan Engel, because I'm going to be interviewing her this afternoon. She has this amazing book about kindergarten. Yep. And one of the things that comes through so clearly in that book is that, the importance of it's the very first collective experience that kids have as, understanding themselves. I'm not just this little kid, I'm somebody's classmate. And like that is entry level democracy. That is 101. It's the place where we start to solve problems together. And so if you're like, if democracy and the idea of collective demands is what makes you nervous, then you can see why public education as a project would be so vulnerable. The fact that we tax ourselves to pay for it, and that people, they always want more, right? They never think we devote enough money to the schools. And it is the central place in our communities where we gather together and envision a future, right? Think about the nature of teaching that you've done so much work about. That is what a teacher does. A teacher inspires a child to imagine that they can be more than they thought they could when they walked through the door to that classroom. And think about where we are politically. We are at a scary, dangerous moment where the people in charge seem intent on diminishing our sense of what's possible. And so those little democratic places where that expansion of that vision happens, those are on the chopping block.
So I want to tease apart that answer. Some aspects of this employ lofty rhetoric to talk about how children get together with other children, and that would presumably happen in a private school too. And some aspects of it may deal with the idea that we're with people who are not like ourselves, so we're exposed from a young age to a diverse group. And that is somewhat less true given the extent to which segregation by class and race happens even in public schools, where there's not a hell of a lot of diversity when you look at people sorting themselves into rich suburban public schools that might as well be private and so on. So how much of what you just said and how much of what you believe is critical for public education is a result of its being public, irrespective of those considerations?
I think that's a really big deal. And of course, within you and I have been talking now for about 7 minutes, and you've already punctured my lofty rhetoric, right?
Just identified it, and there's nothing wrong with loftiness, not punctured.
And I wouldn't just limit it to the distinction between public and private schools. I would also think about what happens within schools, something like tracking, for example.
Right.
The idea that, we've just seen this New York City mayor's race, and like a lot of people, I was very excited about the outcome, but right away, Zoran Mamdani runs into a wall of opposition because he talks about getting rid of the
elite exam schools.
No, actually, he didn't touch that. He talked about getting rid of the kindergarten test for gifted and talented. The kindergarten test. And I understood exactly what he was doing there, because he's thinking about this as a democratic socialist. And here you have a policy that tells a kindergartner, you are not like the other kids, you are special and different.
Right.
And so we see this is happening within our schools. It's happening as far as, the extent to which schools reflect their communities, right? Kids are constantly being bombarded with messages that actually, you're not like the other kids. But I think the key distinction in the initial question that you asked about public and private is that the ability of a private school to handpick who attends there. That, we'll often say something like, it's not school choice, it's the school's choice. And what's been so contentious in these states that are now in the process of moving from a public education system to one that's much more along the lines of letting parents decide where they want their education dollars to go, is that people quickly wake up to the reality that schools can just say, we're not equipped to handle kids with special needs, or we're a religious school and therefore we're not open to kids who have, for example, two moms. And I think when people see this just stated publicly for the first time, it can be really kind of shocking, because all of the subtle ways that public schools have of turning kids away, right? Like, people like me will still make the ardent case that they function as democratic institutions, whereas the private schools, including those that are now publicly funded in a growing number of states, are simply not under the same pressure or responsibility to do that.
When you say function as public institutions, though, to what extent are you saying that that's due to how they function? For example, not just retracking the kids within the school, and how much of it is a function of the fact that they are simply publicly funded, so anything they do, despite anything they do, it's going to be meaningfully democratic because it's public?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because there are clearly so many areas where schools could be more public, right? Like, we'll argue on the one hand that things like school board elections are essential, but then, you look at the just, incredibly tiny number of people who actually vote in them, and the extent to which they often don't represent the communities that are sending their kids to those schools. So that's an example where I think schools fall short on the publicness spectrum. There's a book by a writer and teacher named Jonathan Gerko. I don't know if you know him.
No.
He calls it publicization, that it's, meaning that it's the opposite of privatization. And he goes through and he takes this very clear-eyed look at all of the ways that public schools, where are they public and where do they fall short? Where do, for example, charter schools, where are they actually more public than public schools? And so I think that, I think your question to me about whether, whether my lofty rhetoric actually reflected reality, I think that this is, absolutely the case, that we need to be completely honest about the extent to which public education falls short, right? That if you have to live in a community where the median home price is $750,000, like it is a few miles down the road from me, how public are those schools? Right. You're limiting access to who can afford to buy a house in Manchester by the sea.
But the reality is that public schools can't turn people away. Because they have two moms, because the kid is acting out, needs special accommodations and support, because they don't like the kid. Private schools can and do that all the time. So there's something about the public schools, which I remember one proponent of privatization saying that's the problem with public schools, framing it as a problem, whereas some of us see it as that's a critical nature of a public institution, of its being democratic, that they're going to have to figure out a way to live with these kids.
Absolutely. And think about, for example, something like IDEA, right? Mm-hmm. The law that entitles kids with special needs to a free and appropriate education. It's 50 years old, which, in the scheme of things really is not that long. And so I meet people all the time who are old enough to recall a time when public schools could also turn away kids with disabilities, meaning that the fate of those kids rested on their own families and whether their families had the means to secure some kind of private support for them. Or think about an issue that is playing out right now. We have an expansive Supreme Court decision on the books that entitles kids to public access to public school, whether or not they are citizens. Mm-hmm. And this is Plyler v. Doe, and the Supreme Court said, we can't just think about the lifetime of hardship that's going to be imposed on these kids if they're denied access to public education. We have to think about what happens to all of us. Right. And so we're seeing right now, states try to roll back those protections. Mm-hmm. And I think we will absolutely see this issue playing out across the voucher landscape as well, where you'll see private schools try to test this ground and see whether they actually have to accept kids who aren't citizens.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And of course, with respect to other considerations, private schools have enormous latitude in terms of who they can accept and who they can counsel out, as they euphemistically put it. So are Republicans overreaching now in their attempts to undermine public schooling, to push for vouchers? I mean, Democrats are being urged to steer to the center, to be certainly pro-charter and maybe even pro-voucher. But the reality is that even in red states, people actually like public schools, and often, vouchers keep losing when they're put to a vote, right?
That's such an important point. We got to see this during the 2024 election when vouchers were on the ballot in Kentucky and Nebraska, and sort of on the ballot in Colorado. That was a little more complicated. But what was interesting was that people in those states voted down vouchers by the same margin that they have been defeated every single time that they have gone on the ballot for decades, right? Roughly 65-35. And so what you then see is that, these same states all around the South, particularly, have been enacting these enormous voucher programs. And there was a great study that came out where they looked at the electoral results, and they concluded that what's happened in these states essentially is that voucher advocates have figured out a way to overcome legislative opposition, but they have not figured out how to overcome public opposition. So to me, that's what makes this such an interesting issue. That have these big programs, very expensive, on the books, and yet that resistance in the public that crosses party lines has not gone away.
You've even written about a tremendous anger over vouchers on the right. At some point, wouldn't that catch up with the policymakers on the right who are trying to push it despite the opposition of their constituents?
I think we're already starting to see that. Now, one thing that's really important to point out is that the opposition to vouchers on the right is not necessarily the same as support for public schools. While that may be the case among rural Republicans, the conservative opponents of vouchers tend to be much more concerned about things like government overreach. That, they've been railing against entitlements for decades, and now suddenly their elected officials are saying, you know what, parents? Here, just take this $10,000 in Arizona. We'll load it right onto an EduDebit card for you. You do whatever you want with it, and we don't care how wealthy you are. And so to a lot of conservatives, this sounds crazy, right? Like, this is welfare. And so you'll hear them using language like that. Now, as for is it going to catch up with elected officials? I think that it already has. It makes them so angry, and so what we're seeing is actually a coalescence between on the left and the right among people who are really concerned about big money, about billionaire influence, and they see school vouchers as the policy where this level of influence is really playing out.
But you're saying those people aren't necessarily supporters of public schooling, so where does that leave them in terms of a policy they support on education?
Well, I think they're mixed on public schools. I think that we're talking about folks who may have gotten very caught up in the culture war, right? Like, think about it. Like if you're on the right, you're being fed a nonstop diet of stories about indoctrination. First it was CRT, then it was social and emotional learning, litter boxes, right? Like you name it, they've heard it. That same dynamic where they tend to be very concerned about the nation's schools, less concerned about their own schools, is definitely playing out in red states. But I would say it's less about people being angry over the lack of support for public schools and more concerned about government overreach, they see school choice as a government takeover of private schools and homeschools, and that's what they're opposed to.
They see school choice as government takeover of that?
Yes, they do, because you can tell that I've spent a lot of time talking to these people and reading their documents, because it was so eye-opening to me that this was the first I was hearing about a lot of this stuff. And so they will say that with government money comes government strings. And that this, even though this is being sold using the rhetoric of parent empowerment, what it's really about is the government exerting its influence into spheres that it formerly had no say over. So in Texas, for example, I asked a prominent homeschooling advocate, how many kids in Texas are homeschooled? And she said, we have no idea. And that's just the way they like it, right? And so they see the fact that the government is now going to be funding homeschooling as a way to get its sticky mitts into, there'll be oversight, there'll be regulations, there'll be red tape, etc.
So these people may oppose vouchers, which in many people's mind are synonymous with school choice and with privatization. But you're saying they don't like any government involvement in a voucher scheme, but their opposition to the government means they are, if anything, more adamant in their opposition to public schooling, and they'd like to completely privatize or simply teach their own kids. And to that extent, that may represent an even greater threat to public education ultimately, no?
It's a complicated landscape.
Yeah.
These are complicated coalitions, and they involved groups who had never worked together before.
Right.
And so I would say that the mindset that you just described is one piece of it, but it's not the whole thing.
Okay.
You also have, conservatives who support their public schools, but they worry about things. They think there's way too much ed tech. There is still a lot of unhappiness out there around standardized testing. That brings together people across party lines. And so it's a complicated coalition.
Yeah,
and I think especially in states where there was a level of organizing that we're just not used to seeing. And then they basically lost, right? They lost these voucher state fights. And I'm thinking of places like Texas and Idaho. Holding these coalitions together turns out to be really complicated for exactly the reasons that you just laid out.
And in big picture, the whole push, if not for voucher schemes in particular, but the push for privatization over the last few decades seems to have been driven by two, maybe three, in my mind, and I'll be interested to see if you agree, very, very different constituencies and sets of ideology. On the one hand, you've got the corporate libertarian types, who are the people who talk about, what you refer to as government overreach. They're against public schooling because they're against public everything. But then you've got this other group of largely Christian values-oriented people. And these people are pushing for privatization, not just because they don't like government, but because they're afraid that public schools are too liberal for them. And it turns out that as you probably know, more than 90% of voucher recipients these days in most states are going to religious schools. I hinted at the possibility of a third constituency or reason that privatization began, and that has to do with out-and-out racism. The history of people who started, a lot of these private schools and academies just so their kids wouldn't have to be integrated. But for our purposes, the fissures are visible. I think maybe that's what you're saying here in putting together a group of differing constituents. And that's always been true, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what you're getting at is it's also just a really confusing time, right? That how is it that on the one hand, you have what seems like a really aggressive policy on the right to move as many kids out of public schools as possible, right? That you have people openly stating that that's the goal. And these programs are big and they're only going to get bigger. So Florida has 500,000 kids now who use vouchers, overwhelmingly to attend religious schools.
Right.
But then, so that seems like a very hands-off approach. Like you take the money and you decide, parent. But then we're also seeing a very aggressive move to shape what happens within schools, including to make them more religious.
Right.
And so you see these, states like Louisiana and Texas very aggressively pushing to force schools to post the 10 Commandments,
right,
or all these laws that are bubbling up to replace school counselors with chaplains. And then there's one that has not gotten as much attention, and that is that now schools are not just making it possible, but encouraging kids to leave during the school day in order to participate in religious activities, including, while they're doing the things that schools claim to care so much about, like reading and math, right? That you can leave during the reading block and go to the church activity down the street.
Yep.
So the fact that these things are happening at the same time and often seem like they're in contradiction makes it hard to follow. And then, I think that underlying a lot of this is the question of money. And so I sort of dryly chuckle when I see how much these programs are costing, because I don't think you can really look at the political heft that the anti-tax folks have exercised over the years and think that their goal has always been to spend the same amount of money, but just differently. Like, I think the end game of all of this is to shift more and more of the burden of paying for education onto parents themselves. And so that's how you end up with what seems like kind of a crazy coalition. And you're making a puzzled face, so you better ask a follow-up question.
Well, when do you mean they want to spend less because they're concerned about government deficits and so on? Or are you saying that if we imagined a Venn diagram, there's a hell of a lot of overlap space between the people with the right-wing religious values agenda and those who are anti-government, and they think they've scored a twofer, and they're saying, yes, we get to undermine public schools and privatize it, even though we don't like all the voucher schemes, and we get to privatize and theocratize the public schools that remain, and we get to reduce government interference as they see it in our lives. Is that what you're saying?
I think you laid that out really well. That's the Venn diagram, and that some days it feels like we're hearing more from one piece of it. Like, think about how much progress the religious freedom case has been making of late. Other days, it feels like the anti-tax folks are making more progress. So right now, there are efforts in a number of states to eliminate property taxes, which will absolutely decimate school spending. And so you think like, oh wow, what's their end goal? And those folks, I think, are perfectly comfortable in a world where people just pay for education themselves, and with the kind of brutal inequality that would usher in.
Do you see a difference in the economic background of the people who are making that push? Even if their values are right-wing, do people who are lower income on the right have some concerns about having the financial burden pushed to them?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what you heard people saying in Kentucky and Nebraska when they voted against vouchers. They were really uncomfortable with the idea that for one, that the state was going to be paying for religious education. That made them uncomfortable in the way that it always has. But the other piece of it was that they could really see the writing on the wall that by subsidizing the wealthy and basically picking up a tab for something that wealthy parents are already paying for, that essentially there was going to be less money left over to educate everyone else, and that it was only a matter of time before the burden of paying for schools fell on to them. And they know, right, as an American, you pay for everything. And so the fact that schools are about our last social welfare program, one of the few, and we tax ourselves to pay for it. We redistribute the money. It's the most socialist thing we do. And so think about the vision of restructuring it more along the lines of healthcare or your relationship with your cable provider. And so it's just something you pay for. You have to check that little box where you agree that you'll never sue them. You'll go through binding arbitration. And then if you run into a problem, you call the customer service line, and now you engage with an AI chatbot. What a vision.
So I think it's interesting to consider the extent to which that libertarian philosophy is present even in people with a right-wing religious agenda. Let's call them the values people who don't like the idea of government. But I also wonder how much of that is really just driven by racism and similar ideologies, where some of these folks maybe wouldn't mind pooling our resources as long as it all went to people like us. Do you think that plays a role?
I absolutely think that plays a role. And it's interesting because you really feel all of these strands coming together during the Reagan era. Yep. And so you have the kind of, you've got the libertarian folks who are arguing against government spending. You have that real, push by the religious right to, they want to move kids out of public schools. They want funding they basically want to keep the tradition of the segregation academies alive. And then you hear that current of racism throughout, right? That it's not just, they're not opposed to paying for education for everyone. They don't want to pay for it for the wrong kids, for the kids who can't be educated. And that is where I really feel like you hear all of this coming to the fore today, right? That the resurgence of that rhetoric around race science, the obsession with IQ, and the insistence that there are certain kids who just, they can't be educated. And so why are we spending all this money on them? And those, that Venn diagram that you described it can be a real cesspool.
Yep. And my memory of the Reagan and Bush years was that there was, to some extent, and imperfect, but to some extent, a divide between what was going on in the federal government and in the states, where in the federal government in the Reagan and Bush administrations, you had much more of the libertarian philosophy pushing for vouchers because they also wanted to privatize, Social Security and everything else, whereas it was more of the values/racist impetus for this going on in Texas and other states. But let's shift a bit from talking about a corporate-style libertarian motivation for privatization to talk about corporate-style education or corporate-minded education reform. You wrote an interesting article not long ago where you said, as corporations have fallen from favor on the right, so too has the sort of corporate-minded education reform that the Common Core epitomized. But you mostly quoted religious people, the Christian nationalists like Pete Hegseth and the Opus Dei guys like Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation. But my sense is that the Republicans have long been very big on education as vocational, as corporate-driven, school as an investment, mostly STEM. On the right, you've long had Reagan himself gave a very famous speech when he was governor of California about universities, and we got to get rid of subsidizing intellectual curiosity. The purpose of education is to get kids ready for jobs. The humanities are a waste of time. So if you're right, assuming I'm understanding what you've said accurately, then they've changed. Or has it been the case that there's always been this divide within the right, and there's always been a part of them that has supported corporate-style education?
No, you're right. They've changed. And so that's what really interested me. I kept finding examples of these prominent folks on the right making the case that the emphasis on vocational training in schools going back to the 1920s had been a big mistake. And that if you consider something like the surging popularity of classical education right now, these are both private schools and charter schools, small number of traditional public schools, kids are exposed to the ideals of truth and virtue and beauty, but these are explicitly held up as a counter to a model of education that's so focused on job training, career. And I think so much of it goes back to the Common Core, and that we underestimate the extent to which the revolt against the Common Core on the right helped to usher in our current era of right-wing populism. That right now, the story being told about student test scores, for example, is that, everything was going really well until the 2010s. And then, those teachers and their unions and some affluent parents, they decided, well, they didn't like all the testing. And look where we are now. But that completely leaves out just how significant the revolt on the right was against the Common Core. And this idea, they weren't just angry about government overreach. They were angry about the idea that the curriculum, that the standards, the vision of schooling had been designed by corporations. And you think about the role that General Electric played, or Rex Tillerson, who would go on to be in the Trump administration, but as the executive of Exxon, he was the leading corporate spokesperson for the Common Core. They ran ads on TV.
Well, Bill Gates basically funded the entire apparatus that started it.
The whole thing. And so if you were an activist on the right, if you were in the Tea Party, if you were a populist who was ahead of your time, you looked at this and you didn't just see, the federal government trying to get involved in your kid's education. You saw corporations trying to turn your kid into a corporate drone.
Well, I guess it depends on who you're talking to or who you're reading here, Jennifer, because if you look specifically at many of the most extreme religious figures on the right now, yes, you're going to get that message. But as we've already established, there's quite a bit of shading on the right. And I was traveling a lot to talk about issues of standards and testing through the 90s. And I didn't see what you're describing. Maybe I missed it. I wasn't asking the right people, but I saw the vast majority of pushback on the right against the Common Core as exclusively about the federal government's role. I saw Iowa, for example, say, we are proud not to have federal standards. And many of them were saying, in effect, we don't want those pinheads in Washington telling us what standards and tests to use. We'd like to destroy our kids' interest in learning with state tests and standards. Thank you very much. Obviously they didn't put it that way. And, the right-wingers, not just the centrist Democrats, but the right-wingers back in the 90s were fully behind high-stakes testing and the Common Core. In fact, they saw it as integrally connected to the privatization they want. William Bennett, Checker Finn, Rod Page, Lisa Graham Keegan. The NCLB was hatched by the Heritage Foundation. These people were very pro-testing. They just weren't pro-federal testing. So I guess I need to be convinced that there were a lot of people, and still are a lot of people on the right, who were anti-corporate, both in terms of who was proposing the Common Core and vocational-based education, which I think a lot of them liked.
So for one thing, the 90s were a different era, right? You're absolutely right. It is shocking to go back and read about, to compare what George W. Bush was saying.
Right.
I'm sorry, what Bush Sr. was saying.
Uh-huh.
And then what Clinton was saying, that they used the exact same rhetoric, and that
right.
The public was behind them, right? But the Common Core is later.
No, that's true.
And so what interested me was that I was trying to understand why we've seen such a sharp turn on the right against corporations. That if you listen to the rhetoric among very influential people on the right, they all that stuff about globalists,
yeah.
right? About that it is anti-corporate. And so I got interested in what had changed within the Republican Party, because that's always how I thought of them, right? I thought of them as the party of corporations, that they were the chamber of commerce. But the base of the party has really changed. And so now it is more religious. And corporations are on the outs. And because I'm thinking about, how do we explain what seems like a dramatic shift in their view of education policy? How do we go from the 90s that you just described so well, where you really did have, people across party lines really believed that testing and accountability was going to be the thing that didn't just improve schools, but also help kids move out of poverty? How do we go from that to these hands-off voucher systems where there aren't tests, right? That's a very different view of education policy. How did we get there? And the only thing that I could conclude was that actually we're not looking at the same Republican Party anymore. We're looking at a base that has transformed. And then my argument about the Common Core was that I just think that is a misunderstood, that played a more central role in helping orchestrate the transformation of the Republican Party than we have really understood.
Huh. Interesting. I was not precise a minute ago when I talked about what I saw in the 90s. What I meant to say was that same pro-corporate sensibility among the right and only opposition to the federal involvement, I saw carried over into the 2000s when the Common Core began, which is why I'm surprised to hear you describe a change. I'm still trying to figure out how much of it was a change across time and how much of it is who you're listening to even now within the right, such that it might be the case that there is still a push for corporate-oriented vocational STEM education and against the humanities, even in the right. And with respect to testing, I mean, the conservative Christian homeschoolers test their kids around the kitchen table. It's just that they're buying homeschool versus tests. There's no anti-testing philosophy. There's maybe an anti-standardized testing philosophy, and I would argue mostly an anti-federal standardized testing philosophy. But you seem to be saying something different, which is interesting because it challenges my view of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think, it's a really confusing time that we have come out of 3 decades of what you just described,
yeah.
Right? And it's not clear what is going to replace it.
Right.
And I think that's why there's such fierce, you can really feel the folks who are protesting and pro-accountability exerting their influence right now, right? That they want to make sure, particularly on the Democratic side, they want to make sure that remains the focus of their party. But I think that the Republicans are actually quite split about this, which is why you see policy kind of all over the place. That you see them actively encouraging things like classical education, vouchers where there's very little oversight, but also, in some ways, like making public school even more vocationally oriented than ever. One of the few areas of bipartisan agreement that's left is career and technical education, right? Everybody likes that.
Right.
So yeah. And then I would look at what's happening with the federal government with respect to the investment in science, right? That think about the bipartisan agreement that everybody needed to study STEM. That was how we were going to outcompete the Chinese and whoever was in line right behind the Chinese. And yet it's clear that the federal government don't seem to be down with that right now, right? That they seem to have a profound ambivalence about science.
Do you see charter schools continuing to play a role to allow mainstream Democrats to support what I regard as educationally very reactionary, top-down, corporate-styled standards and testing approach, but not go as far as to privatize it?
I think that charter schools are going to end up being a casualty of our profound partisan era. And that, for various reasons, and that all of the energy in the charter school world right now is going to be around religious charter schools, which puts Democrats just in a terrible bind, right? That they're basically in a position of saying that, people like you who always warned about a slippery slope, you turn out to be right. And so the Democrats who were most emphatic in their support of charter schools sound very defensive to me. And then I think the other thing is that the model of charter schooling that turned out to be really effective at raising test scores, it became quite unpopular, right? That there isn't the same level of enthusiasm around no excuses schools. I just read a really interesting interview with the guy who started the Match charter schools here in the Boston area. And he's now shifting his focus away from what happens within the classroom because he feels like part of the reason that the no excuses model of charters did not really deliver in terms of changing the life outcomes of these kids is that, that they're just like with any kind of school, that what's influencing these kids is happening from 3 p.m.
right
until, and so I thought that was it was a very interesting acknowledgement on his part. But it's a sign, I think, like, well, what direction should the charter schools go in? And the real excitement is the right-wing charter schools. It's classical education and it's religious charter schools.
Yeah. And by the way, that limit of charter schools, even assuming they were doing something valuable, I would say intellectually it was powerfully destructive because it was focused on a martial mentality of mindless obedience in order to raise test scores, not to create imagination or critical thinking. But, and also, of course, they pushed out a lot of kids to artificially create the illusion that even by their own criteria, they were succeeding academically with these kids. But what's true about the limits of that is true with respect to our point where we started this discussion about education more broadly, which is even if it's done exactly the way we think it should be done and in the public arena, you don't end poverty with education by itself, right?
Yeah, so this is my really like singular obsession. It's what I'm working on right now because I feel like, the Democrats for basically 3 decades just created such a trap with their insistence that education was the way to move people out of poverty. And so to the extent that there is a left populist wing of the Democratic Party that people are excited about, you'll notice they don't talk that way. They don't sound like Rahm Emanuel when he says, the American dream starts one student and one opportunity at a time.
Right.
They did that.
Very individualistic.
They followed, they got more education just the way that Barack Obama told them to as he was, talking to us during the financial crisis, right? Like they went to college and now as a result, they find themselves to be downwardly mobile.
Right.
So we're at this really interesting time, but boy, is it unresolved. There are a lot of people who remain incredibly wedded to that view. It's such an American view.
Yes.
Well, the schools can fix it.
Right. And that comes from an anti-collectivism. It's not about us. It's about me and him and you. So vouchers in some ways are the logical conclusion of the same individualism that leads the people in support of public schools to say public schools will propel each individual kid ahead in his or her trajectory in life. So let's talk about the Department of Education at the federal level. Maybe that should be our last big topic. As we are having this conversation, which is sometime before people will be listening to it, they want to abolish it. You said not just because of racism or because of opposition to the federal government, because of a desire to deepen inequality. What do you mean by that? Why would that be the reason for getting rid of the DOE in particular?
So when you think about the role that the Department of Education plays and why we have it, it was intended to smooth out inequality. And what's so fascinating is that, I don't think most people are aware that the first Department of Education did not come during Jimmy Carter's administration. It actually came in the wake of the Civil War. And the idea was that federal officials were going to monitor how good of a job the southern states were doing teaching newly freed slaves to read. And as you can imagine, that did not go over very well with a lot of the southern legislators. And so what they did is basically exactly what we're seeing now, right? They cut the budget, they cut the staff. And so, but ultimately it was the vision they didn't believe in. They didn't believe that people of different races were equal. And we hear such similar language from really the highest level of government officials these days, the obsessive interest in IQ. And I think, they're comfortable with that level of inequality. They think it's natural. They think it's desirable. And they think that there are certain kids who are just meant to go to work. And by work, I'm not talking about a career after high school in STEM, right? I'm talking about kids going to work in factories, kids working in the fields. And that's, to them, anything the government does to put its thumb on the scale in order to make us more equal is social engineering.
Right.
And and because that's the role we expect our schools to play in this country, right? That it really is we want them to be that great equalizer. And it's the fact that they never are able to deliver on that disappoints us so much, generation after generation. Well, what if you think equalizing as a mission is bunk, right? What if you think it's DEI? What if you think that actually it's been a big mistake to have so many women go to college? Then it's not a surprise at all that they would go so hard at the Department of Education that they would wipe out its civil rights enforcement arm. Yeah. But also, as much as you and I don't like standardized testing, I have to say that the fact that they really went after the people who keep track of how kids are doing, that really worried me.
The Institute of Education Sciences, which is part of DOE. With respect to what you're saying here, Woodrow Wilson said, "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks."
There you go.
And that's what we've got now. But remember, it's not just about smoothing out the differences in terms of race and class. The DOE also is the main provider of and enforcer of provision of services for kids with special needs. And you've got a constituency there that runs across ideological lines, right? So why are right-wingers with special needs kids or in their families putting up with that?
So you're absolutely right. And I think that's a big part of the reason why that money did not get moved. The way that, they've been basically divvying up the pots of money that the DOE oversees. And so the primary pot of money for elementary education went to the Department of Labor, which they also hate. But they didn't move special needs money. And that's because, precisely what you're saying, that there is a bipartisan and vocal constituency. And if you've been paying attention to the battles over redistricting, something's really interesting happening in Indiana, right? That the Republicans there are fighting amongst themselves. And one of the vocal opponents of redistricting that state in order to make it more red is someone who has a special needs daughter who was appalled by the way that President Trump talked about Tim Walz. And he said, I'm not going to do anything that this guy wants. He should spend the rest of his term showing us that he deserves to be there. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think that is an explosive issue. And one, education is really one of the few areas where they've had to back off of some of their more aggressive moves. And special education is right there at the center of that.
Well, this could change by the time people are listening to this conversation. But while we're talking, I'm seeing a renewed emphasis on undermining it, destroying various aspects of it, and then claiming, we'll move some of the services to the Department of Labor and so on. How harmful would its abolition be as opposed to just being a symptom of the sort of anti-woke right-wing agenda?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, as you know, the federal government really doesn't make up that big of a part of education spending, right?
Yeah.
That it's kind of funny that, on the one hand, we've heard these wildly exaggerated accounts of what the federal department does, right? That they'll insist that it's driving curriculum, that anything you don't like, blame the feds. But now, as they're breaking it up, they've swung to the opposite extreme. So Linda McMahon, the secretary, will say things like, "We're basically just a pass-through agency." But I think for states that are heavily reliant on federal funding, and these are poor and rural states, this stands to be a big deal. We're already seeing that the fact that they went so hard after the civil rights unit. That we, schools are the place where civil rights are both defended but also expanded. And so that's I think that puts vulnerable kids in a more vulnerable position. But the real answer to your question is that we just don't know. A lot of people, I think, are really surprised by how far they've gotten towards reaching this goal.
Yep.
And so I always urge people to pay attention to the big picture. Listen to what else they're saying, because it's so easy to get lost in the policy weeds on this stuff. And, you start talking about the titles, and before long, the person you're talking to is dozed right off.
Hopefully not our listeners here. Yes, how they end up doing it. But of course, conservative Republicans have been trying to get rid of DOE from the moment of its founding in the 70s, I guess. But Trump is able to exert his will in a way that others on the right have not been able to, and it does protect. Yeah, federal spending accounts for single digits of the total nationwide, but a disproportionate amount in making sure that civil rights laws aren't broken and that special needs kids get what they need and so on. And so that's what the Trump regime is all about. It's about going after the people who they see as the most vulnerable. And of course, as you say, putting some of us who are critical of standardized testing in an awkward position because, standardized testing, not the right way to collect data here. But here we're seeing an opposition to collecting all data about the climate, about vaccines, about anything, because that way we don't have a problem anymore to fix, because it's gone away. That's the way Trump's mind works. So you travel a lot through conservative communities, through red states, trying to link education to other issues that people are organizing around to mobilize conservative supporters of public education. So maybe let's end with this. What takeaways do you have for what seems to be promising as ways to push back on all of this?
Yeah, so I pay a lot of attention to these sort of off-cycle elections. So you may have seen the news, that the Democrats have been winning a surprising number of them. Mm-hmm. So there was one in Georgia this week. And so I always go right to I want to know more about the candidates and how do they talk about public education? Because, if you're running for state and local office, it's always a big issue. And so one thing I noticed was that the Democrat who won, he won in a Trump district in Georgia, that he turned out to know a lot about school finance, and he made that a big issue. And he pledged that if he got into office, he was going to work to repeal the voucher program that the legislature enacted last year. And so this interests me because it's wildly at odds with the narrative we're hearing from national Democrats who, as you noted, are really pushing. They want the party to move to what they call the center. And that would include things. They really want people to run on the idea that schools have failed. And that we, you hear some of them saying now that vouchers are the way forward. And often they will say that Democrats used to be the trusted party on education. They're not anymore. And so then I always wonder, well, gosh, that's weird. Why do they keep winning then? Why are they winning and making education a central part of what they're talking about? And why is it that candidates who have people really excited, and not just Democrats, but populist candidates who talk differently about politics. Why is it that they talk about schools so differently, that they use that language of democracy that we were talking about earlier, and that they point to things like school privatization as an example of the overwhelming influence that billionaires have? I saw a poll this week that 80% of Americans across party lines think that billionaires have too much influence in politics. And school vouchers is the top priority for an incredible number of them. It is really shocking. And so if you're someone in a red state who feels like, your legislature has been bought, that your representatives no longer represent you, that they represent the highest bidder, school vouchers is absolutely key to why you think that. And so I feel like this is something, if our goal is to make our politics less corrosive, public education, the thing that we fight about so much, turns out to be like a really key way of bringing people back together again.
Except that we began talking about the difference between one's view about vouchers and one's view about public versus private education. So there may be widespread agreement as a unifying, organizable principle that we don't like these voucher plans. But if many of these same people on the right continue to be skeptical of, if not outright opposed to, a diverse, secular, robust system of public schooling, how do we bring them aboard on that, as opposed to just being against voucher plans?
Well, so they're one part of a sprawling coalition. So I wouldn't overstate the extent to which, actually their goal is to wipe public schools off the map. Uh-huh. They just don't want to go about it in this way. Like, I would focus on what are the areas of agreement. Uh-huh. And if you look at a state like Texas, the fury over the influence that billionaires had in the last legislative session, right? The fact that the richest man in Pennsylvania essentially bought their legislature, right? That is more of a unifying force than their particular views on education policy is a dividing one.
Huh. Oh, it's a genuine kind of populism as opposed to the faux populism of Trump et al., you're saying. But you think that opposition to billionaires can be used to support a diverse secular public school system?
I do, because for example, and I'll use Texas because it was just so explicit there, uh-huh, that you had multiple billionaires, and so some of them are homegrown to Texas. You have these oil brothers, and their goal is to basically create an entirely separate education structure, not just K-12, but vocational schools, colleges and universities that are entirely religious. Well, that makes a lot of people really nervous. Even people who are religious themselves, even people who are religious homeschoolers, they think that's a little weird that you have these, why do these guys have so much power? And so, I think that it turns out that, there's real populist energy out there, and that public education, even people who are unhappy about the state of the schools today, that turns out to be a great issue to rally them around.
Okay. Well, the populism is a wild horse, but maybe we can find people who can ride that horse and steer it, and that's where the metaphor ends as far as I'm concerned. Jennifer Berkshire, thank you so much for spending time and helping us understand beyond what the headlines are saying about what's going on with education, what we need, and what risk we're facing. It's been a very illuminating conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the Kohn zone.
I have to get every guest to end that way now. Right.